Welcome to Iorwerth, the home of modern Welsh politics.
As part of our short series discussing the role of nuclear power in Wales, we are delighted to welcome Mabon ap Gwynfor, member of the Senedd for Dwyfor Meirionnydd and the author of the brilliant new book, Going Nuclear, which discusses all the common conceptions and misconceptions of nuclear power. From discussing the idea that it brings with it well-paid jobs, to the fact nuclear energy will be an essential part of our future energy mix, Mabon's book covers it all. Welcome, Mabon. Thanks for joining us tonight. You know, a Senedd member writing a book is a great thing to see. It is an excellent read. But can you tell us what inspired you to write this book in the first instance?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for the invitation to take part on the pod. The story behind the book is interesting, to be honest. When I was a candidate for Dwyfor Meirionnydd in the last election, clearly there was a lot of talk back then around a renaissance in nuclear power, and we've got Trawsfynydd in Dwyfor Meirionnydd, and there was some pressure on me to support the demands for a new reactor in Trawsfynydd. And I've always been what I call a skeptic of nuclear power and nuclear technology. And then when I was elected, I was lobbied heavily by the sector, by third-party organisations, by companies involved and others. And they gave me one side of the debate and explained how, in their view, it was absolutely necessary and a brilliant technology. And I expressed my concerns on a number of issues to do with safety, to do with links with militarism and other things. And they promised me that they would come back with briefing notes to correct my concerns or correct some of the assumptions I had. Unfortunately, they never did come back. They only asked for more meetings. And so I took it upon myself to do that research myself. So I went about and asked world experts from Canada, France, the UK, Japan, Australia, and elsewhere about information around the impacts on the environment, the impacts on communities where uranium is mined, around the safety of it, around the economy of it, and everything else. And the picture that was painted in that research was very, very different to the one painted by the lobbying groups and the organisations that wanted me to support nuclear in the first place. And so that's what the book is, essentially, a culmination of that research, bringing together all that information that I had. And in that process, I thought to myself, well, surely I shouldn't be getting all this information and keeping it to myself. This information needs to be out there. Others need to know what I'm hearing. And that's why I went about and published a book then, just bringing that research together in one book form.
I think you mentioned Trawsfynydd, and obviously the other Welsh nuclear legacy area is on Anglesey with Wylfa. You know, there's a suggestion that the popularity of nuclear energy is quite high in your constituency. So this could be considered quite a brave thing to publish. Do you think that's the case?
I don't know whether it's brave, and I don't know whether the support is high. Now, clearly what we do know, evidence shows that in what someone calls a nuclearized society, then there is a greater support for nuclear because those communities have become used to it without necessarily seeing the direct negative impacts of nuclear on those communities. So I can understand why some people would support it, and we've had 2 or 3 generations working in Trawsfynydd and Wylfa, and personally I respect all of those individuals. I have friends working in Trawsfynydd on the decommissioning site now, and I fully understand where they come from, but we disagree. There's no argument or there's no falling out on it, but we disagree on the technology. But, you know, I've come across a lot of people who have approached me before the publication of this book and post-publication who are really concerned about nuclear. Some have been historically, and some are now concerned about the new talk for nuclear. So I'm not convinced that there is a huge support for nuclear out there. The evidence that I'm getting is that there's huge concern around it.
In fairness to you, in the book, you don't just look at it from one side. You have a lot of admiration for the scientific achievements of nuclear power, despite your kind of self-confessed skepticism. Can you talk us through some of those kind of areas that you did find you could admire in your research?
Well, look, if we go back to the previous pod where you had Rachel Garrick on, she's clearly an exceptionally intelligent individual. She must be to be working in that field. And I have the utmost respect for her and for those friends of mine working in the decommissioning site in Trawsfynydd, who are also exceptionally talented and fantastically intelligent individuals. Anybody that can work in nuclear must be intelligent academically with a number of things, and having breaking the breakthrough of splitting the atom initially and then finding how to harness the power of the atom when it's released, and then all of the technology that's come from that is an immensely clever achievement, and we can't underestimate it. It's at the moment probably at the peak of human ingenuity. So I've got nothing but respect and admiration for those individuals, the scientists, the technicians. You've got some fantastic welders working in that field who understand the steel and the components involved. So yeah, completely in admiration of the individuals there. But I don't support the technology. It's pretty simple. The technology is dirty. It's extremely dangerous. The toxic and radioactive legacy of nuclear, not just from the material used in power generation, but from the process of mining nuclear all through to the used material. We've got a toxic legacy there that will last tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. Before the Romans, if our ancestors, those that left Eastern Africa and went out across the globe, if they discovered uranium and cracked the technology back in those days, hundreds of thousands of years ago, we would still be dealing with a legacy today. We will be a different species by the time we are able to clear up this mess that is left behind. And it is toxic and radioactive. It's a killer. There is no way of dealing with the waste, either in the mining communities or in the areas where that material is used for fuel purposes. But not only that, the link between nuclear fuel and weapons grade plutonium and military use of nuclear is absolutely clear. So it's not a good material in any case. It's used for the ultimate weapon, and we saw the initial versions in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which killed over 150,000 immediately between both of them. And we know that if they dropped one of those bombs today in an act of aggression or defense, it would result in the killing of hundreds of thousands of people immediately and millions of people indirectly afterwards. So, it's something we shouldn't be looking to support.
That the look around the military use of nuclear is something in this short series we haven't really touched on. So if I can just bring that to the fore, because there are increasingly links between civilian and military uses of nuclear energy, isn't there?
Absolutely. We know historically, nuclear is still relatively young. They only had the breakthrough in the late 30s, 1940s. So since that period of the end of the Second World War and during the Cold War period, we know that developing nuclear as a source of fuel was actually a facade, because the first nuclear power plant was in Calder Hall, and that was basically a plutonium factory. We know that. There's plenty of evidence for it. They try to hide it a little bit, but, if you read Hansard going back to the 1950s, it becomes clear that, yes, it was used initially for plutonium. We know in Trawsfynydd that Unit 2 in Trawsfynydd alone, and this is research carried out by the US government, Unit 2 in Trawsfynydd during its lifetime, produced 3.633 metric tons of weapons-grade plutonium. So in that, the first decades of nuclear, there was a clear link that the plutonium that was created in those reactors was used directly for the purposes of weapons. Now, things have changed since then. So it's not so direct now. The waste isn't used directly for weapons. What we're now seeing is that link, the skills link between both sectors. And that's why, essentially, we're seeing this drumbeat and this drive towards a new generation of nuclear power. We wouldn't see it otherwise, is because the UK government realised back in the early noughties that they needed a new fleet of nuclear-powered submarines, and the new dreadnought would be coming online, as well as the Astute class of nuclear-propelled vessels. Now, the UK doesn't have that skill set required in order to maintain those submarines and nuclear vessels, let alone Trident, the weapons, the missiles. And, they hadn't recruited nor developed the skills required, because all the nuclear power stations were slowly, gradually winding down and closing. So they realised they needed the skills. And that's why we're now seeing this drive for new nuclear power stations, is because in that sector, they will be producing the fantastically intelligent young people that will be required in order to transfer those skills to maintain the nuclear military equipment. Now, we know this because if you read some of the material by Rolls-Royce, for instance, if I bear with me 1 second, I've got quotes in my book. Let me just find some of the quotes here. The then chief executive of Rolls-Royce's small modular reactor program, said developing a UK SMR, small modular reactor, would help Rolls-Royce maintain UK capabilities for the country's military nuclear naval program. Then, on a Rolls-Royce glossy leaflet, they said one particular application for deployment of the talent developed through the UK SMR programme would be in the ongoing maintenance of the UK's independent nuclear deterrent. Then also, we've got Sir Stephen Lovegrove, who, on record in one of the committees in Westminster, made clear, he said, we are looking at a number of decades from here on in where there is going to be intensive nuclear activity in the UK, building the submarines, renewing the warhead, extending the missiles, building the new civil nuclear reactors, and continuing with the immense task of decommissioning. So there's a clear link there. They make it pretty obvious that it's interchangeable, and they need the skilled individuals in order to maintain those naval weapons and technology. So if we're opposed to Trident and weapons of mass destruction and nuclear-powered vessels, then we shouldn't really support new nuclear power, because we don't need new nuclear power.
That's really interesting, actually, and it's an area I wasn't so aware of, that kind of link between the civilian and the military side of it. But you mentioned in your answer there around the deterrent, and I suppose we've got to mention, if we're talking around the military, and that kind of suggestion that nuclear weapons have acted as that deterrent to more traditional conflicts from larger global powers over the last 50, 60 years. Is that something we should be considering in this, or could you argue against that as well?
Absolutely, we don't need nuclear weapons. We need to unilaterally disarm our nuclear weapons and put pressure on every other nuclear society and country to disarm as well and get rid of their nuclear weapons. It hasn't stopped Russia from invading Ukraine. The fact that the UK and NATO have nuclear weapons hasn't stopped that at all. We've seen wars being fought across the world over the last few decades, and nuclear weapons didn't stop any of it. The biggest threat that we have seen in the world over the last couple of years was COVID. and nuclear weapons didn't do anything to stop COVID-19 and the mass deaths that came from that. So, nuclear weapons haven't deterred anything. In fact, it's only made things worse. And what it has meant is we've seen a diversion of resources from worthwhile projects, like investing in finding a treatment for cancer, for instance, or other health-related issues, or investing in teachers and the education of our children, instead of having those billions of pounds going into those worthwhile projects. We've seen that money being invested in nuclear weapons and nuclear technology. And we know that the nuclear sector are saying they're looking at employing around 100,000 people in the nuclear sector over the next few years. Well, those people could instead be, and the fantastic skills and intelligence that they have, could be put to research in health, could be put to work in our universities, to educate our young people, could be put to other uses for peaceful purposes, rather than developing nuclear technology linked to weapons.
No, I think there's a strong argument there, and but I think the whole discussion on deterrent and current conflicts around the world is for another pod. I'm sure we'll have you on for that. But it is, that kind of idea about conflict and geopolitical positions. A lot of what we're talking around is around that, what happens in the political environment. So where do you think things are now surrounding the nuclear energy argument, both within the UK and within Wales?
Well, we know that the Welsh Government are currently pushing for nuclear in Wales. I don't understand why. We can't afford it in Wales to begin with. It is the single most expensive form of energy production. It is more expensive than anything else. And in fact, we pay more for our electricity here in Wales than any other part of the UK, especially in North Wales. We pay the highest prices for electricity. So we're actually subsidising through our electric payments here. We're subsidising the money that goes into nuclear, which will be the most expensive form of power. So I don't understand why the Welsh Government are so keen on promoting nuclear currently. I think they've just fallen for the PR around it, and think that for whatever reason a developed Western country needs nuclear. That's not true. We look at most of the Scandinavian countries. We look at other countries that are advanced and developed, and they don't have nuclear power. And we're seeing Germany and Austria calling for other countries to go out of nuclear, and they're very advanced societies. So I don't know why they're doing it, but I think we need to make sure that people are aware of the dangers of nuclear. Nuclear is being dressed up as an answer to environmental concerns. It absolutely isn't. It's one of the biggest selling points currently. Why people are promoting nuclear is because of global warming. But it's not going to answer those concerns in any way at all. And we need to, put that argument to bed immediately. So, I'm afraid I can't answer that question, Kerry.
It's fair to say, so Welsh Government are going down that supportive route. UK Government with the current administration are certainly looking at that.
Yeah, the UK government, let's go for the UK government. The UK government are promoting nuclear for a number of reasons. First of all, with the environment. They're saying that it needs to be part of the mix, right? Rubbish. First of all, nuclear won't play any part at all in tackling climate change until anything after 2050, right? So the United Nations have made it clear that some 4 years ago, they said, look, we've got 12 years before we reach a tipping point. Yeah, and we cross that threshold of 2 degrees Celsius warmer than what it was pre-industrial period. Well, we're going to cross the 1.5 degrees pretty soon, if we're not there already, actually. And now we've got 8 years in order to really do everything we can to tackle global climate change. Now, they started Hinkley Point C under Theresa May and we're still probably 10 years away from getting Hinkley Point C fired up and producing energy. That's just one that's been promised. They promised, the UK government, actually back in 2008, promised 11 new nuclear reactors to help tackle global climate change. We're only building half at the moment. So if they think nuclear is going to play a part in tackling climate change, then we would see more urgency around this. But we're not seeing any urgency around it. We're just seeing a lot of money thrown at it, a lot of PR and a lot of talk around it. So nuclear isn't going to play any part in that. They're also saying that it needs to be part of the energy mix. Well, we know that, let's just look at Wales. Wales is currently producing more energy than what we are using. We're exporting energy. And if you look at the National Grid's projections, 2050, Wales will be producing even more energy without nuclear. We'll be producing even more energy and exporting more energy. So we don't need nuclear in Wales. The UK doesn't need it. We've got around the UK, we've got the most fantastic resource already for energy generation. That's the wind that we have, that's tidal. We also have solar ability, let alone the technology that's been produced in storage, battery, for instance. Now, what the UK government should have done is invested a fraction of what they put into nuclear into tidal energy. And we would have Swansea Bay, for instance, up and running by now. But they haven't. They've instead thrown money at nuclear, and we still don't have a new reactor. So as part of the energy mix, we don't need it. We've got enough other forms of energy generations. They're also saying that, we need nuclear for baseload purposes. Again, that's not true. In fact, the National Grid is saying that if we had more nuclear online, it could be dangerous because in the summer, at quiet periods, we could be having too much energy being produced, which would create a massive problem for the grid. In the summer, we can produce the energy we need through solar, through tidal, through other forms of generation. And in the winter period, when we have high demand, we've got enough wind here, let alone everything else. So again, we don't need nuclear. The other part, incidentally, I forgot to mention with the environmental argument is, again, if you look at the National Grid's projections, nuclear is damaging the environment now as we speak. And they'll explain that to you. Because of the constant promise of new nuclear since the early noughties, but definitely since around 2008, the UK government have promised nuclear, saying, nuclear is going to come online, it's going to save us, but it never has. And because of that constant promise, but over-promising and under-delivering, we have kept with gas. We've not invested in other forms of generation to the degree we should have, and we're using more gas. And as a consequence, we are likely to be at peak gas in about 2 years' time, because we're using this gas thinking that nuclear is going to come online all of the time. So we're using more carbon-intensive energy production means because of a promise that's never delivered. And that's why, actually, they should just hold their hands up and say, look, nuclear isn't going to deliver what we want. In fact, again, National Grid says by 2050, SMRs will only contribute something like 1% to 3% of our nuclear generating capabilities, which is, negligible. Storage is going to be far more than that, is going to be around 8%. Marine will be around 3%. So let's be honest and say nuclear isn't going to play a part definitely not in the short term and not in the medium term either. So let's put the resources into mature technology that we can invest in immediately and make a real difference for the environment.
Very compelling argument there. What I was going to get on to is the current Conservative administration in Whitehall is certainly pegged to the nuclear argument. But if there's an incoming Labour government, is their energy policy to follow the same suit, or have they got a different approach?
I'll be honest, I don't know. That's up to the Labour Party. I don't design their policies. I would hope that the Labour government would not support it, but seeing Keir Starmer supporting everything else that the Conservatives have put forward recently, I wouldn't be surprised if the current iteration of the Labour Party would continue with this drive towards new nuclear.
Yeah, no, thank you. I wasn't trying to catch you. I just thought it might have been something on energy policy, either you or I was aware of, and the fact that neither of us are maybe says something about
Mm,
forthcoming energy policy. But
yeah.
you know, on the political side of it, this might be one of our difficult questions for you, and certainly the nuclear argument is. As a green leaning on my side of it, I do find nuclear difficult, and so what you're talking about tonight is really, really interesting to how I'm positioning my thinking. But it's a
Well,
difficult.
let's deal with that green part, by the way, initially. If you
Well,
look across the world,
I meant the Green Party, not
yeah,
the
yeah,
the
yeah, the
Green.
Green
Oh, right.
Party and the Green Movement, yeah. In my research for the book, I spoke to leaders of Green parties across the world. One of them was in Canada, Lorraine Reckmans. She was fantastic, and she's absolutely against nuclear. There are Green parties across the world against nuclear, except for Finland. And Finland is in a unique situation because they're feeling threatened currently by Russia and all the pressures that leads to, and they've changed their position on that. But the Green movement is against nuclear. If you talk to Greenpeace, and I spoke for a long period with Doug Parr of Greenpeace, the senior scientist within Greenpeace, they're adamantly against nuclear. They don't see nuclear as an answer. If you talk to the WWF, they're against nuclear. If you talk to Friends of the Earth, they're against nuclear. All the major green organizations, part of the green movement, are against nuclear, except for a few individuals that have been fairly outspoken. But those individuals are the exceptions that prove the rule.
Well, no, it's very much where I am. I'm on the negative side towards nuclear at the moment, but these pods are great for giving information on what I think we feel people need to hear a little bit more about. But where I was going to go with my political question,
Sorry.
Mabon, is no, it's really useful. It is around your own party's political position on it and the difficulty there has in within Plaid Cymru. Can you talk us through where the party is on that?
Yeah, we've got policies on nuclear which says that we don't support any new nuclear and development of new sites in Wales. There's a differing of views amongst individuals, and I respect those views. I absolutely respect the individuals. I'm good friends with them, but we disagree on the technology. Now, some of those individuals, I understand fully why they support nuclear. They support nuclear for the same reasons that I support other things. They want to see more jobs. I want to see more jobs. So I respect that. They want to see something that will help with the environment. I certainly want to tackle climate change. So I respect that. They want to see energy security. I want to see energy security. And so I respect that, but I disagree with the conclusions. And so that's why we have to have this friendly conversation continuously in order to reach a point as a community and as a society where we can move forwards, even though we might have differing views, but we can move forwards in an amiable way. Now, we will disagree on some things. That's the nature of politics. We can't agree on everything, but we have to keep that respect as we move forwards.
No, it's well, that's something we'd all like to see a lot more of in politics, whether it's within individual parties or between parties. But one of the things we talked around is how nuclear energy has come back to the fore. Because
Mm.
if we think back to the 90s and 2000s, certainly in the UK, perhaps not some of our continental friends, but nuclear energy was thought to be an old technology, which we were decommissioning and closing down. What has brought about that resurgence? Is it about energy security and the climate change, or is there more? Is it that military link which you mentioned earlier?
The reason we're seeing this drive towards new nuclear is because of military. Nothing else really. The energy that will come from it and other things is a bonus as far as those people pushing for new nuclear is concerned. But we know that the old vessels, nuclear vessels that we had to be decommissioned. Their lifespan was coming to an end, and they needed the dreadnought to come online. they needed new nuclear-propelled vessels, and they needed to maintain Trident, and they needed to try to have more independence when maintaining Trident rather than depending on the US. And simply, that's the reason why we're seeing new nuclear. And that's why, incidentally, we're seeing a drive for nuclear power in Australia. Now, there's no nuclear power generation in Australia. The Australian government have been pretty strong on opposing the generation of nuclear power in Australia. But now there's a new agreement between the UK, the US, and Australia, the AUKUS agreement, and Rolls-Royce have won the contract to build nuclear-propelled vessels for Australia. Now, Australia clearly wants their own independence when maintaining those vessels, and that's why we're seeing, primarily on the right of the political spectrum in Australia, a call for nuclear power in Australia, because they know that they need the skills from that sector to transfer to maintain the nuclear vessels that they will be getting out of the AUKUS agreement.
It's an interesting dynamic there. I was just thinking about Rolls-Royce have weighed into the argument on a new station outside Cardiff, the Cardiff Parkway station. It's amazing how everything is all linked in this global world.
It is interesting. Rolls-Royce, they are probably the favoured partner for developing a new SMR. They have been for a while. You talk to the sector and the industry and they'll say, oh no, there are other organisations that we're looking at. But we know it's going to be Rolls-Royce. Let's not beat around the bush, because Rolls-Royce have the contract for Dreadnought. Rolls-Royce need that skills and the workforce in order to maintain the nuclear-propelled vessels that they have and the nuclear submarines. So, it will be Rolls-Royce, even though there's talk of other companies as well. And that's why we're seeing the push for Rolls-Royce, and Rolls-Royce is the main company talked about when it comes to new nuclear in the UK. And that link is indisputable.
And Rolls-Royce, as you mentioned, are the firm behind SMRs, as you said, small modular reactors. And it's badged as a new technology, but that's not strictly true, is it? And it's quite pertinent to you in your constituency with Trawsfynydd, because that's been earmarked as a site for a potential SMR. What are your thoughts on where we might be with SMRs over the next 20, 30 years, particularly in your part of Wales?
Well, we're not going to be anywhere, to be honest, I don't think. An SMR isn't a new technology in as much as a small reactor is what Rolls-Royce have been producing over the last 40-odd years in the submarines that they have, but generating power is slightly different again. SMRs, the proposal for Trawsfynydd with Rolls-Royce would be a 470 megawatt reactor. That's not exactly small. That's the same generating power as the old Magnox in Trawsfynydd. But, they've not passed the required safety tests yet for SMRs. There was one company, NewScale, that they were relatively advanced in their development of SMR in the USA. And they were hoping to develop SMRs for Idaho and that region of the US. But that agreement has collapsed. They've had to pull out because there was no funding for it. All the funders sort of ran away from the project because the cost increases were such that they just didn't see any profit in it for them. They didn't see any money. It wouldn't generate any money for investors. So investors are running away from nuclear. There's no commercial SMR active anywhere in the world currently. So they will have to, in order for it to become commercial, you can't transfer what's in the US, by the way, to the UK because they run on different plans. So if you're going to have a Rolls-Royce or NewScale or Holtec or any of the other companies develop an SMR in the UK, then they need to pass the 3-stage generic design assessment process. Rolls-Royce have passed the first stage, but they're way off the second and third stages currently. Other companies haven't passed that first stage yet. So we won't see an accepted design for an SMR probably for 5 to 8 years, right? So then they'll try concurrently to get some planning permission in place, but you can't get a full planning permission in place and everything around that until you have a full design. So then after they pass their generic design assessment stages, they will have to get planning. And that'll take a heck of a long time in order to get planning in place. So should we see an SMR being developed in the UK and in Wales, we are probably at least 12 to 15 years off seeing anything being developed, probably 20 years plus, okay? So an SMR isn't going to create any jobs in Trawsfynydd or Wales this side of 12, 15, maybe 20 years. It's not going to be active. It's not going to play any part in tackling global climate change. And in fact, research now suggests that SMRs are even dirtier than conventional reactors. So I honestly don't see SMRs playing a role, but that's where all the PR is. That's where all the attention is at. And everybody's getting excited about this glitzy new technology. If you scratch the surface, it's just a mirage. It's not there at all. And you know, I've done the research into this. I've written a book about it. You know, so it really isn't there. Don't believe the hype.
You're putting that case across very, very strongly. But even if it is a new industry and the glitzy promo videos, I saw a couple this week, do get people to consider nuclear. We need to talk about waste. There isn't any new way of dealing with the waste at the moment, is there at all?
No, there's no way at all. Now there's waste on two levels. First of all, there's waste on the mining side of it. And I've spoken to communities in Canada, in Ontario and Canada, and in the Northern Territories of Australia, where they mine uranium. Those communities are amongst the poorest communities in those countries. They suffer the highest levels of illnesses, various cancers, stillbirths, and other serious ailments that are a direct consequence of uranium mining. Suicide levels are higher there as well, incidentally. And the uranium mining isn't just getting uranium out of the ground. You know, to get just 7 kilos of fissile material, you need to dig out 1,000 tons of rock, you know, and then that has to be leached and cleaned. Now, that leaching process is using sulfuric acid. And all that waste, the toxic waste from the sulfuric acid and the radioactive waste from the uranium and the yellow cake, that all flows into the various river and water bodies in the area, which are then contaminated for thousands of years. So there's that part of it, which is dirty and can't be tackled. And then there's the waste from the energy generation process. And Sellafield is the single biggest storage of nuclear waste, and there's nothing they can do with it. Now, in Finland, they've started to develop an idea, and they've built this sort of cave system, a mine. You go down a quarter of a mile or something in Olkiluoto in Finland, and they're going to dump this the waste down in the mine and cover it with a tar or something like that in order to try and stop it leaching out. On the face of it, that sounds like a reasonable proposition. You know, it's out of the way and there's no people walking around it. But the crust of the earth moves constantly. The worst thing you can do is probably put it in the ground, because at some point, maybe not in the near future, maybe not over the next few hundred years, but at some point, that's going to be leaching out, and it will seep out and find its way into other parts of the crust. And we know evidence from Australia shows where they had nuclear testing, that nuclear that fell and was used in parts of Australia is seen 4 or 5 generations down the line in animals that have been eating the plant life in those areas. So that nuclear carries on generations down the line and is dangerous. the best thing you can do with nuclear waste currently is keep it somewhere where you can see it and monitor it. And that's above ground, unfortunately. But that's extraordinarily dangerous. We know that the Irish Sea is probably still the most radioactive and dangerous body of water in the world, except for maybe the area now around Fukushima in Japan. But, Sellafield has been losing 1,000 tons of radioactive water a day into the ocean there. It's really, really dangerous. And there's no way of treating it. They always talk about breakthrough in technology, about how to treat it, and which is, it's always short term. They in the nuclear testing sites in the Pacific Ocean, you might have heard of Bikini Atoll and Castle Bravo bomb sites. Well, the USA brought together all of their nuclear waste from the US and from those test sites. And they put it all on one island and put a huge concrete dome over it, the Rhun dome, they called it. And it was the best technology, the most modern concrete technology in the world, and that would store the radioactive waste beneath it, and it would be safe. That was 40 years ago, after I was born. That Rhun dome, that concrete is now cracking, and all that nuclear waste is starting to leach out into the Pacific Ocean. It's not safe, and that's only 40 years. So, whatever we come up with today, we might think that we're brilliant and we're going to solve it. It's never the case. And the costs of maintaining that, not just for the next 40 years, and, the lifespan of a nuclear reactor is only around 40 years, but the cost of maintaining that and keeping that waste safe for not even 10,000 years, you're talking about tens of thousands of years. That's a burden that we're putting on generations yet unborn that we can't even imagine yet.
If Welsh Government continue with their proposals, it'll be interesting to see how the Future Generation Act picks that up.
Absolutely, exactly.
One question I've got around the book is that you draw out a continuing thread around nuclear power being used as a tool of colonialism, that continued extraction and abuse of natural resources in Wales. Can you just explore that a little bit more?
Yeah, well, I touched on that in my previous answer. It is a colonial force, you have companies and wealthy individuals that go into communities like the Northern Territories, like in Kazakhstan, like in Ontario. And these are communities of the indigenous peoples as well. And they extract the natural resource from those communities, in this case, uranium, and they take billions of dollars out of those communities. And more often than not, it's against the wishes of those communities. You just talk to the communities in the Northern Territories in Australia, and they don't want to see uranium mines in those communities. They have argued against them. They've voted against them. They've had representation in Parliament against them. But nevertheless, these forces come in against the will and against the wishes of those indigenous communities, and they extract those resources away, take the money with them, and leave a legacy of poverty, of ill health, and of toxicity behind. Now, that's happened across the world when it comes to uranium. When it comes to the generating, of energy, they purposefully selected originally communities that were far away from the large conurbations. And there's a reason for that, because they knew that the technology was dangerous. If they really wanted nuclear energy for factories in Birmingham or London or Manchester, well, why not build them in those areas? And they would have far less waste of energy as the energy was being transmitted across the lines. But no, they selected communities very, very far away and that were poor. And yes, we've had Wylfa and Trawsfynydd, but we still have some of the poorest communities in the UK in those regions. We have lower incomes that are elsewhere in those communities. So the legacy isn't a legacy of wealth. We know that in those communities, the companies made billions in money selling electricity, but that money wasn't reinvested back into our communities. We didn't have any control over that. So that's what I mean when I talk about a colonial force. All across the journey from mining through to production, communities and people are taken advantage of. And, I don't want to be a part of that. I don't want to see us having energy produced in Wales, certainly not the weapons from the nuclear technology here, from the back and from the suffering of people in Kazakhstan, in Canada, in the US, in Australia and elsewhere. We should be looking to the resources that we have, and we've got plenty of them here in Wales, to be self-sustaining in energy production. And when we produce too much, then we can also, as we are doing, export it for a profit for Wales. That's not happening currently.
No, I think that's a really nice point to end our discussion on nuclear. Wales isn't benefiting currently, but I don't want to leave it there, because you and I first met when I had a health hat on, and you are now Plaid Cymru's health spokesperson. And just while we've got you, it's been quite a tumultuous week in the health sector in Wales, really. And while it's not ideal to talk on a nuclear pod about health, I did want to get your thoughts on the minister's announcement around the special measures. And it seems that quite a few more of our health boards across Wales might not be in the top tier of special measures, but it's changing, and they're all in some degree of kind of inspection or review period at the moment, aren't they?
Yeah, every health board in Wales is in some sort of escalation measure. And there's a reason why Hywel Dda isn't in special measures, and that's simply because the minister introduced a new level, a fourth tier into the system, where it was 4 tiers, now it's 5. Now, any other day, Hywel Dda would probably have been in special measures. It's not now because she's introduced that. So it clearly goes to show that by introducing that new level of intervention, instead of getting to grips with the problems facing our health boards and the health service, instead of being more hands-on and directing things and making sure that the health boards aren't spending money that they don't have continuously, instead of making sure that they are properly funded from the off, instead of doing that work, it's a sticking plaster, sticking new intervention level in there. So it goes to show that there's just no new ideas there. The government have run out of ideas of how to get to grips with health problems. And the one starkest issue that came out from that announcement was the fact that in the Grange Hospital, which, it's a brand new hospital, it's meant to be a state-of-the-art hospital, the minister said that they would need to spend an extra £14 million for patient safety. That's a statement there, isn't it, of failure. How did they reach this point where 4 years after opening the Grange, they are now having to spend 14 million on making it safer? There are huge question marks there, and I will be contacting the Auditor General and asking for the Auditor to look into that, because, I've been in a position where I built my new house. I developed a centre in Dolgellau, and at the end of it, you have a snagging process. You look at the problems, and you have a snagging list, and you deal with those issues before you pay the final bill. Well, why didn't they go through that process properly and making sure that they had the hospital in place? Now, they rushed it. That's the truth of the matter. Everybody knows that they rushed the opening of the Grange before it should have been done, and the government must answer for that.
Yeah, I think there's all good points. I was pretty familiar with the issues at the Grange, and it is sad to see that we're in this position. But I just wanted to say thank you for that. Like, your knowledge on nuclear, I think it came through hugely in the pod. So we really do appreciate you coming on and talk us through from your position. If people wanted to get hold of the book, what's the best way of doing that? Is there a preferred way of purchasing, or is it in all good bookshops?
Probably the best way is to go onto the website www.goingnuclear.net, and they can buy it from the website. It's in shops in Caernarfon and Porthmadog and Bala and Carmarthen and Pontypridd, I think, and a few shops in Cardiff currently. But if you can't find it there, then goingnuclear.net is the best place.
That's your book. But obviously with the health hat on and your wider Senedd role, people might want to follow you or hear more about what you're up to on social media. What's the best way for capturing that?
Twitter or X is at Mabon ap Gwynfor.
That's great. Okay, thank you, Mabon.
No problem, Skerry.
If you thought tonight's pod with Mabon was interesting and you haven't listened to the Counterpoint pod we did with Rachel Garrick, please find that on our website or on any of our social media apps. If you have enjoyed today's episode, then you can find more from Hiraeth on the various podcast apps. We are on all the socials at Hiraeth Pod, and if you want to support us with your wallet as well as your ears, you can do so from just £3 a month at patreon.com/Hiraeth Pod.
Thank you for listening to Hiraeth. If you like what you heard, please don't forget to subscribe, rate and review.